Sometimes love finds us in the most impossible moments, when duty and desire pull our hearts in different directions. We've all felt that ache of wanting someone we cannot have, someone the world says is wrong for us. 200 warriors surrounded Jarl Toste's Longhouse, spears raised, demanding surrender. The southern chieftain's voice boomed across the courtyard, promising death to any who resisted. But Brynhild, the Jarl's daughter, saw only one man, Hakon, a simple fisherman's son with nothing to offer but his love. He stood between the armies, neither running nor hiding. She had been promised to another man. Their marriage meant to bring peace between warring clans. Yet as steel rang from sheaths and horses pawed the frozen ground, she faced an impossible choice. Would she follow her father's wishes or her heart's calling? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping giants, curling around the wooden posts of Jarl Toste's Longhouse, as if reluctant to let go of the night's secrets. This was the land of the north wind, where stone and sea carved men into legends, and where honor mattered more than gold. The Longhouse itself stood as a testament to 3 generations of careful, alliance building, its oak beams hewn from trees, that had watched over these lands since before the first Norse. Ships touched foreign shores. Brynhild had awakened before dawn, as was her custom, to the sound of waves against the rocky shore below. From her sleeping alcove, she could see the fishing boats returning, with their nets heavy with the night's catch. Among them, she knew, was Hakon's small vessel, its weathered hull cutting through the water with the same quiet determination that marked everything he did. Her heart quickened at the thought, then immediately clenched with the familiar weight of impossibility. She rose and wrapped her woolen cloak around her shoulders, the fabric soft against her skin, but unable to warm the chill that had settled in her bones these past weeks. The silver arm ring her mother had given her before dying caught the early light, a twisted band of precious metal that had belonged to her grandmother and her grandmother's mother before that. Each woman who wore it had faced impossible choices, her mother had told her. Each had found a way to honor both love and duty, though the cost had varied greatly. The Longhouse stirred to life around her as servants began their daily tasks. The great hall stretched nearly 60 paces from end to end, its walls lined with shields bearing the marks of allied clans. Tapestries woven by the women of the household depicted the great deeds of their ancestors, sea battles won, lands claimed, oaths sworn that had lasted generations. This was her inheritance, this web of honor and obligation that stretched across the northern fjords like an invisible net. Jarl Toste emerged from his chamber, already dressed in his finest tunic, the silver threads catching the firelight from the central hearth. Her father had grown grey in service to his people, his once golden beard, now the colour of winter storms. Lines marked his face, some from laughter, others from the weight of decisions that affected hundreds of lives. He had ruled with wisdom and strength for 20 years, forging alliances that kept their lands peaceful while others warred endlessly. The boats return early today, he observed, joining her at the great window that looked out over the water. His voice carried the measured tone of a man who weighed each word carefully. "The fishing has been good," Brynhild replied, though they both knew their thoughts lay elsewhere. The formal betrothal feast was planned for the next new moon, when Eric Magnusson would arrive with his father's blessing and a dowry that would secure trade routes through the southern valleys. It was a good match, her father often reminded her. Eric was young, strong, and said to be kind to his servants. His clan commanded respect, and their union would bring prosperity to both houses. What her father did not know, could never know, was that for the past 4 months, Brynhild had been meeting Hakon in secret. It had begun innocently enough, a chance encounter on the shoreline, where she practiced her sword work in the early morning hours. He had been mending his father's fishing net. The worn rope spread across the rocks like a web of determination and necessity. Hakon's hands moved with the same precision, whether guiding a boat through treacherous waters or repairing the tools of his trade. His father Olaf had been lost at sea when Hakon was barely 15, leaving him to care for his younger sister and aging mother. The net he worked with bore the marks of countless repairs, patches where storms had torn it, places where it had been rewoven with newer rope. Yet it remained strong, reliable like the man who wielded it. Their first conversation had been about technique. She had been struggling with a particular sword form, and he had observed that her stance mimicked the way his father had taught him to balance against a storm. "The sea teaches patience," he had said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had learned hard lessons young. "It shows you that strength without balance is just another way to fall." She had been struck not just by his insight, but by the way he looked at her. Not as the Jarl's daughter with her fine clothes and political importance, but as a person struggling with a challenge. In his eyes, she saw none of the calculation that marked the glances of visiting Jarl's sons, none of the deference that made real conversation impossible with most men of her station. Their meetings had continued, always carefully arranged, always before the household stirred. She would slip from the Longhouse while the guards dozed at their posts, making her way to the secluded cove where Hakon prepared his boat for the day's fishing. They spoke of many things: the changing seasons, the stories their grandparents had told them, the dreams they harbored but dared not voice to others. Hakon had dreams beyond the fishing nets, though he was not ashamed of the work that fed his family. He spoke of the great explorations he had heard about in the taverns, of lands across the western sea where the sun set differently and new opportunities waited for men brave enough to seek them. But always he returned to his duties, to the people who depended on him, to the honest work that had shaped his character since childhood. Brynhild found herself drawn to this balance in him, the way he could dream of distant horizons while remaining rooted in responsibility. It was so different from the young men who visited their hall, warriors who spoke loudly of their deeds but seemed to have no understanding of the quiet strength required for daily devotion. To family and community, the silver arm ring seemed to grow warm against her skin as she watched the fishing boats approach the shore. Soon the men would beach their vessels and divide the catch according to ancient custom. Hakon would take his family's portion and sell the remainder, using the silver to buy supplies for the coming winter. It was a simple life, an honest life, but one that offered no path to the Jarl's daughter. "You seemed distant this morning," her father observed, though his tone suggested he suspected the cause of her preoccupation. "Eric sends word that he looks forward to meeting you formally. His father speaks highly of his skill in both battle and governance." Brynhild nodded, the expected response. "I am honored by his interest." The words felt like ash in her mouth, but they were the words expected of a dutiful daughter. Around them, the Longhouse continued its morning rhythm, servants preparing the great table for the day's meals, warriors checking their weapons and discussing patrol routes, the constant hum of a community that had found its balance through generations of careful tradition. Yet beneath this familiar routine, Brynhild felt the tremor of approaching change. The morning light revealed riders on the distant hills, too many riders, moving with the purposeful formation of a warband rather than the casual pace of traders or messengers. Her father had noticed them too, his hand moving unconsciously to rest on the pommel of his sword. "Send word to the watchtowers," he said quietly to his captain, never taking his eyes from the approaching force. "And have the horns ready." The peaceful morning was about to end, though none of them yet understood how completely their world was about to change. In the cove below, Hakon secured his boat and began the walk up the hillside path, the morning's catch in a basket on his shoulder. He moved with the easy stride of a man comfortable in his own skin, unaware that destiny was riding toward them across the northern hills. The silver arm ring caught the light again as Brynhild's hand tightened unconsciously around it. Her mother's words echoed in her memory. Each woman who wore it had faced impossible choices. She had always wondered what her mother had meant. What choice could have been so difficult for a woman who seemed to have lived such a contented life? Now, Watching the riders draw closer, while her heart pulled toward the young man approaching from the shore, she began to understand. Some choices could not be made with the mind alone. Some required the wisdom of the heart, even when that wisdom led toward pain rather than peace. The morning mist began to lift, revealing the day's harsh clarity. Soon, very soon, there would be no more time for secret meetings or gentle dreams. The riders would reach the Longhouse by midday, and with them would come demands that would test every oath and alliance her father had carefully constructed over the years. Brynhild touched the arm ring one final time, drawing strength from the legacy of strong women who had worn it before her. Whatever came next, she would face it with the courage they had shown, though she could not yet imagine what form that courage might need to take. The only certainty was that by sunset, nothing would be the same. The riders crested the final hill as the sun reached its zenith, their war banner snapping in the cold wind like the wings of a great black bird. Brynhild had seen that banner before in her father's collection of tapestries, the blood eagle, symbol of chieftain Magnus the Ruthless, painted in crimson on a field of midnight. It was said that Magnus had earned his name not through reckless violence, but through his methodical approach to warfare. When he decided an enemy must die, that enemy died, regardless of how long it took or what obstacles stood in his way. 200 mounted warriors spread across the hillside in perfect formation, their spears creating a forest of steel points that caught the sunlight like deadly stars. At their head rode Magnus himself, a man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. Even at this distance, his presence commanded attention. Broad-shouldered and iron-grey, sitting his black war-horse as if he had been born to the saddle, Jarl Toste's war horn sounded 3 long blasts, the ancient call that summoned every able-bodied man to the Longhouse. Within moments, the peaceful morning dissolved into controlled urgency as warriors emerged from the surrounding buildings, their mail glinting as they took positions along the defensive walls. But even Brynhild could see the hopeless mathematics of their situation. Toste could muster perhaps 60 fighting men, and half of those were past their prime or too young to have seen real battle. "Father," she said quietly, moving to stand beside him on the great porch that overlooked the courtyard. "What does Magnus want here? Your alliance with his clan has held for 10 years. Toste's jaw tightened, his weathered hands gripping the wooden railing. "Magnus honors no alliance that does not serve his immediate purpose. If he rides here with this force, it means our usefulness to him has ended, or he has found a way to gain more by breaking faith than keeping it." The war band approached slowly, deliberately, each hoofbeat measured and ominous. This was not the wild charge of raiders seeking quick plunder, but the methodical advance of a force confident in its overwhelming superiority. Magnus was making a statement with every step. Resistance would be not just futile, but foolishly expensive in lives. Hakon appeared at the edge of the courtyard, his fishing basket forgotten as he took in the scene. His eyes found Brynhild immediately, and she saw in them the same recognition that chilled her own heart. This was no diplomatic visit or trade negotiation. This was the kind of arrival that ended with either total submission or total destruction. Magnus raised his hand, and his entire force came to a halt just beyond arrow range, close enough to display their numbers, far enough to avoid any desperate last gesture from the defenders. The chieftain himself rode forward alone, his black horse dancing with barely contained energy. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the courtyard, pitched to reach every ear within the Longhouse walls. "Jarl Toste," he called, his tone almost conversational despite the circumstances. "I bring news from the southern fjords that affects us both. May I approach under the guest right, that we might speak as civilized men?" The request was formally correct, but the threat underlying it was unmistakable. Guest right was sacred among their people, but it meant nothing if the guest chose to ignore it once inside the walls. Still, refusing the request would be seen as an admission of guilt or fear, and would justify whatever Magnus chose to do next. "You may approach," Magnus Ironwill, Toste replied, using the chieftain's formal name rather than the darker title most people whispered. "You and 2 of your men, no more." Magnus smiled, the expression as cold as winter wind on bare steel. "Generous as always, old friend." He dismounted and selected 2 of his largest warriors to accompany him, men whose scars spoke of many battles survived. As they walked across the courtyard, Brynhild noticed that Magnus kept his weapons peace-bonded, another formal courtesy that meant little when 200 armed men waited just outside. The great hall had been hastily prepared for this unexpected audience. Servants brought bread and salt, the traditional offerings that sealed the guest rite, while Toste took his place in the high chair that had belonged to his father and grandfather before him. Brynhild stood at his right hand, as was proper for the heir to his holdings, though she noticed Magnus's eyes evaluating her with the calculating gaze of a man appraising livestock. "You mentioned news from the south," Toste said once the formalities were complete. "Speak freely." Magnus accepted a cup of ale and drank deeply before responding, his casual manner more unsettling than open hostility would have been. Indeed, grave news. Young Erik Magnusson met his end 3 days past, ambushed by raiders while returning from the harvest blessing at Olaf's Grove. 20 good men died with him, including his father's champion. The words hit Brynhild like a physical blow. Erik, her betrothed, the young man she had never met but whose marriage to her was supposed to secure peace between their clans, dead before she ever had the chance to know him. She felt a confusing mixture of grief for a life cut short and guilty relief that fate had intervened where she had lacked the courage to act. "My condolences," Toste said carefully. "Erik was said to be a man of honor. His loss diminishes us all." "His loss," Magnus agreed, "creates certain complications. The alliance between our houses was sealed by the promise of marriage between Erik and your daughter. With Erik dead, that alliance dies with him, unless new arrangements can be made." "Here it comes," Brynhild thought, her hand unconsciously moving to touch the silver armring beneath her sleeve. Magnus had not ridden here with 200 warriors to offer condolences or discuss trade agreements. "I have a proposal," Magnus continued, setting down his cup with deliberate precision. "My own son Grim stands ready to take Erik's place. The boy is young but proven in battle, and eager to forge strong ties with the northern clans. A marriage between Grim and your daughter would not only maintain our alliance, but strengthen it considerably. The trap was perfectly laid. Refuse, and Magnus would claim that Toste had broken faith with the southern clans. Accept, and Brynhild would be bound to a man she had never met, son of a chieftain whose word was worth less than smoke on the wind. Either way, Magnus gained what he truly wanted: control over the strategic position that Toste's Longhouse commanded, overlooking the main sea route between the northern and southern territories. "This is sudden," Toste replied diplomatically. "Such arrangements require careful consideration. Time," Magnus interrupted, "is a luxury we no longer possess. The raiders who killed Erik were not random bandits. They were agents of the eastern clans, testing our strength and resolve. If we appear divided, if our alliances seem uncertain, they will strike again. Your people, my people, all the coastal settlements will burn while we debate the proper forms of negotiation." The lie was smooth, practiced, but Brynhild caught the slight pause before Magnus spoke of raiders. Erik's death had been no accident, no random attack by eastern enemies. Magnus himself had arranged it, eliminating the young man who might have grown strong enough to challenge his authority, and replacing him with his own son in the alliance. "What terms do you propose?" And Toste asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer would be unacceptable. "The wedding takes place within the week," Magnus said. "Here, before all our people, with the full ceremony that honors both our houses. In return, I pledge the protection of my warriors for your lands and people. Protection that you clearly need, given the forces arrayed against us." The courtyard beyond the great hall had grown quiet, as if the very stones waited to hear Toste's response. Brynhild could see Hakon through the window, standing with the other common folk who had gathered to witness this confrontation. His face was carefully neutral, but she could read the tension in the set of his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "And if I decline this generous offer?" Toste asked. Magnus smiled again, the expression never reaching his eyes. "Then I fear I cannot guarantee your safety from the eastern raiders. Such tragic accidents have been all too common lately. Entire households simply vanishing in the night, their longhouses found empty except for the crows. Terrible times we live in, when even the most careful preparations cannot protect good people from such random violence." The threat was clear as crystal. Submit, or face the same fate that had befallen Eric, death disguised as the work of convenient enemies. Magnus had come not to negotiate, but to dictate terms, backed by overwhelming force and the willingness to use it without hesitation. In the silence that followed, Brynhild felt the weight of generations pressing down upon her shoulders. Every woman who had worn the silver arm ring had faced impossible choices, her mother had said. Now she understood what that meant. Moments when duty and desire, love and survival, honor and necessity all pulled in different directions with equal force. The answer would determine not just her own fate, but the lives of everyone she had ever known. And somewhere in the courtyard below, Hakon waited, not knowing that the woman he loved was about to be bartered away like a prize of war. The silence stretched like a bowstring drawn to its breaking point. Jarl Toste sat motionless in his high chair, the carved dragon heads that adorned its arms seeming to snarl at the unwelcome guests. His weathered hands gripped the armrests, knuckles white with the effort of containing his rage. Around the great hall his warriors shifted restlessly, hands drifting toward weapon hilts despite the sacred protection of guest right. Magnus waited with the patience of a predator that knows its prey has nowhere to run. His two companions flanked him like twin pillars of menace, their scarred faces impassive but alert. Outside, the sound of 200 horses stamping and snorting carried through the windows, a constant reminder of the force that backed up this mockery of diplomacy. "You ask much for so little time to consider," Toste said finally, his voice carefully measured. "A father's duty to his daughter requires more thought than you would allow." "A father's duty," Magnus replied, "is first to ensure his daughter lives to see another season. Dead daughters make poor brides, and the eastern raiders show no mercy to women or children." Brynhild felt something cold and hard settle in her chest at those words. She'd been raised to understand politics, to recognize the careful dance of threat and counter-threat that governed relationships between the clans. But this was different. This was the language of conquest disguised as negotiation. The diplomacy of the wolf addressing the sheep. "I would speak with my daughter privately," Toste said, rising from his chair. "Surely a man of your wisdom understands that such decisions cannot be made lightly." Magnus inclined his head with mock courtesy. "Of course. Family councils are the foundation of wise governance. But the sun moves swiftly across the sky, and my men grow restless when they sit idle too long. Shall we say you have until the evening meal to reach your decision?" The implied deadline hit like a physical blow. Hours, not days. Time enough for Magnus to position his forces exactly where he wanted them, but not enough for Toste to send messages to potential allies or organize any meaningful resistance. It was perfectly calculated pressure, applied with the precision of a master strategist. Until evening then, Toste agreed. Though his tone suggested he would rather agree to his own execution, Magnus and his companions departed with the same measured ceremony they had used upon arrival. Every gesture designed to reinforce their complete confidence in the outcome. As soon as they were clear of the great hall, Toste's carefully maintained composure cracked like ice in a spring thaw. "Summon the war council," he ordered his captain, "and send riders to the beacon towers. If we must fall, let our allies know why." "Father," Brynhild said quietly, touching his arm, "the riders will never reach the beacons. Magnus will have scouts watching every path." Toste looked at his daughter with eyes full of pain and pride. "I know, child. But a man must try, even when the trying itself is hopeless. It is what separates us from the beasts. The war horn sounded again, its deep note calling the household's senior warriors to council. But as the men filed into the hall, Brynhild could see the defeat already written in their faces. They were good men, experienced fighters who had served her father faithfully for years. Yet even their combined skill could not overcome the simple mathematics of 200 to 60. Hakon appeared in the doorway, still carrying his fishing basket, looking uncertain whether he belonged in such august company. Toste noticed him and beckoned him forward with a gesture that surprised everyone present. "You served well during the grain ship incident last year," Toste said, referring to the time Hakon had helped rescue a cargo vessel that had run aground during a storm. "Your counsel has value here." Hakon set down his basket and approached the high table, moving with the careful dignity of a man who understood the honor being shown him. Brynhild caught his eye for just a moment, seeing in his steady gaze the same quiet strength that had first drawn her to him. Whatever came next, at least they would face it together, even if only as members of the same doomed community. The council convened around the great table where Toste's ancestors had made decisions that shaped the fate of the northern fjords. Maps were spread, showing the defensive positions available and the likely approaches Magnus might use if negotiations failed. But the exercise felt hollow. Everyone present understood that this was not a military problem that could be solved with clever tactics or superior positioning. "We could attempt inviting withdrawal to the high caves," suggested Ulrich, the grizzled captain who had served Toste's father before him. "The passages are narrow enough that their numbers would count for less." "And then what?" asked another warrior. "We hide in the mountains while they burn our homes and take our families. That is survival, not victory. Survival has its own honor," Toste said quietly. "Dead heroes protect no one." But even as they discussed defensive strategies, Brynhild could see her father's mind working on a different problem entirely. He kept glancing toward the ancient war horn that hung above the hearth, a massive instrument carved from a great sea beast's tusk, decorated with silver bands that told the story of battles fought and won by previous generations. That horn had called men to war for over a century, its voice carrying across the fjord to rally allies and strike fear into enemies. "There is another way," Hakon said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tactical discussions like a blade through silk. Every head turned toward him, and Brynhild saw him straighten under their collective gaze. Drawing on reserves of courage she had only glimpsed during their private conversations. "Speak," Toste commanded. "The old laws," Hakon continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "The right of single combat to settle disputes between clans. If Magnus truly believes his cause is just, let him prove it, according to ancient custom." A murmur ran around the table, half admiration for the young man's boldness, half dismay at his apparent naivety. Magnus had not ridden here with 200 warriors to settle matters through single combat. He had come to take what he wanted by force, using the pretense of marriage negotiations to make the conquest appear legitimate. "You think Magnus would honor such a challenge?" Ulrich asked skeptically. "I think Magnus is proud," Hakon replied. "And pride can be used against a man if you know how to apply the lever correctly. He has made this about honor and ancient alliances. Let him prove that honor in the sight of his own men." Brynhild felt her heart racing as she began to understand what Hakon was proposing. It was audacious to the point of madness, but it was also the only path she could see that offered even the slightest hope of avoiding total capitulation to Magnus's demands. "You would stand as our champion?" Toste asked, his voice carefully neutral. "If you would have me," Hakon answered simply. "I have little to offer except my life, but that I give freely in service to this house and its people." The words hung in the air like a prayer offered to distant gods. Around the table, hardened warriors looked at the fisherman's son with new eyes, seeing not just courage but the kind of selfless devotion that had inspired the greatest heroes of their people's songs and stories. The War Council. dispersed as the afternoon sun began, its descent toward the western mountains, leaving behind a tension thick enough to cut with a blade. Toste had agreed to present Hakon's challenge to Magnus, though every man at the table understood the likely outcome. Magnus had not brought 200 warriors to watch his champion fight fairly. He had brought them to ensure that fairness never entered the equation. Brynhild found Hakon in the armory, examining the weapons available to him with the methodical attention he usually reserved for his fishing nets. The similarity struck her forcefully. The way he tested each blade's balance, checked the grip for wear, assessed the quality of the steel with patient, experienced hands. Whether preparing for battle or for the sea, he brought the same careful professionalism to the task. "You cannot do this," she said quietly, closing the heavy wooden door behind her to ensure their privacy. He looked up from the sword he had been examining, his eyes meeting hers with that steady gaze that had first captured her heart. "I cannot do nothing while your father's house falls to a man like Magnus. You will die," she said bluntly, unable to soften the harsh reality with gentle words. "Magnus's champion will be chosen for size and skill, not honor. This is not a saga where courage alone carries the day." Hakon set down the sword and moved to where she stood, close enough that she could smell the salt air that always seemed to cling to his clothes. "Perhaps. But dying in defense of what matters is better than living as a slave to what does not. What matters to you?" she asked, though her heart already knew the answer. "You matter," he said simply. "Your happiness, your freedom to choose your own path, the right of your people to live without fear of men like Magnus. These things matter more than my life," she wanted to argue, to find the words that would make him see reason and abandon this impossible gesture. But looking into his eyes, she realized that asking him to step aside would be asking him to become someone else, entirely, someone who could watch injustice unfold and comfort himself with the knowledge that he had survived to see another day. "Then we do this together," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "If you mean to stand as champion, you will not face your fate unprepared." Hakon frowned, not understanding her meaning. "Brynhild, I cannot ask you to—" "You are not asking," she interrupted. "I am telling. My mother trained me in sword work from the time I could lift a blade. If you mean to challenge Magnus's champion, you will benefit from every advantage we can provide. For the next hour—" She guided him through the techniques her mother had taught her, subtle adjustments to stance and grip that could mean the difference between life and death in single combat. Hakon proved to be a quick student, his natural balance and coordination serving him well as he adapted fishing boat reflexes to the demands of sword play. "Your footwork is already strong," she observed as they practiced basic forms. "The sea has taught you to adjust your balance without thinking about it." "The sea teaches many things," he agreed, executing a defensive sequence with growing confidence, including that survival often depends on reading the signs others miss. They were interrupted by a commotion in the courtyard, shouts and the sound of hoofbeats approaching at speed. Through the narrow window, Brynhild could see a single rider approaching the Longhouse under a peace banner, one of Magnus's men bearing what could only be a response to the challenge that had been formally delivered an hour earlier. They made their way to the great hall, where Toste was receiving Magnus's answer with the grim expression of a man who had expected no better. The messenger spoke with the clipped precision of a warrior delivering orders rather than negotiating terms. "My Lord Magnus accepts the challenge, as is his right under the ancient laws. Combat will take place at the Dueling Stones at dawn tomorrow, witnessed by representatives of both houses. The champion who falls will be considered to have died in honorable service to his clan. The Dueling Stones, a circle of ancient standing stones on the hill overlooking the fjord, where champions had settled disputes for longer than anyone could remember. The ground there was considered sacred, protected by oaths sworn before the first longhouses were built in these lands. It was, Brynhild realized, the one place where Magnus could not simply overwhelm Hakon with superior numbers without breaking faith with traditions that predated his own clan's rise to power. "And Magnus's champion?" Toste asked. The messenger smiled with the cruel satisfaction of a man delivering a death sentence. "Grim Magnusson will stand for our house. The same Grim who was to marry your daughter, should you have chosen wisdom over pride." Brynhild felt the blood drain from her face. Grim was famous throughout the southern fjords, a giant of a man who had never lost in single combat, whose reputation for brutality was exceeded only by his skill with sword and axe. He had earned his place as Magnus's heir, not through birthright alone, but through a series of victories that had crushed every challenger who had faced him. "So be it," Hakon said quietly, stepping forward to stand beside Toste. "I will meet Grim at the stones when the sun rises." The messenger looked him up and down with obvious disdain, taking in Hakon's simple clothes and fisherman's build. "You are the champion?" Magnus was told that Toste had warriors of reputation in his service. "I am Hakon Olafsson," he replied with dignity that transformed his humble appearance into something approaching nobility. "I stand for this house and its people. Hakon Olafsson," the messenger repeated, as if memorizing the name for a song that would never be sung. "Grim will be pleased to know his opponent's name when he carves it on the stone that marks your grave." After the messenger departed, the Longhouse settled into the strange quiet that precedes great events. Servants went about their duties with hushed efficiency. Warriors checked their weapons reflexively, despite having no role in tomorrow's combat. And the elderly women of the household began preparing the ritual. Foods that would honor the dead, though none spoke openly. Of who might require such honors by sunset, Brynhild found herself standing once again at the great window, watching the sun sink toward the horizon like a great red ember dying in the darkening sky. The silver arm ring felt heavy on her arm, weighted with the expectations of generations of women who had worn it before her. Each had faced impossible choices, her mother had said. Each had found a way to honor both love and duty. But what did honor mean when love itself demanded a sacrifice that duty could not permit? Tomorrow, the man she loved would face certain death in defense of a cause that was already lost. Whether he won or lost, the outcome would be the same. Magnus would find a way to claim what he wanted, and her father's house would fall unless she could find a third path, one that her ancestors might have walked, but which remained hidden from her understanding. The silver arm ring caught the last light of day, its twisted bands seeming to writhe like living things in the fading illumination. Somewhere in its ancient patterns lay the answer she sought, if only she had the wisdom to read the signs correctly. The hours before dawn crawled by like wounded animals seeking shelter. Throughout the Longhouse, people moved with the restless energy of those who could neither sleep nor find useful occupation for their hands. In the great hall, warriors sat sharpening weapons they would not use, while servants prepared food that few would eat. The approaching combat cast its shadow over every conversation, every gesture, every breath drawn in the slowly passing night. Brynhild had not even attempted sleep. Instead, she sat in her mother's old chamber, surrounded by the possessions that had once belonged to a woman whose wisdom she desperately needed. Her mother's sword lay across her lap, a blade forged by masters of the craft, its steel still bright despite the years since it had last seen battle. The weapon was too light for a man of Hakon's size, but its balance and craftsmanship might serve him better than the heavier swords in her father's armory. She had spent the night hours examining every piece of her mother's armor and weapons, searching for anything that might tip the scales in tomorrow's combat. But more than equipment, she found herself hoping for insight, some understanding of how a woman could honor both love and duty when the two seemed to tear each other apart. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Enter," she called, expecting one of the servants with news or refreshment. Instead, Hakon stepped through the doorway, moving with the quiet caution of a man who understood he might not be welcome in such a private space. He had clearly not slept either. His hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled from long hours of restless pacing. But his eyes held the same steady resolve that had marked his offer to stand as champion. "I could not sleep," he said simply. "And I thought you might be awake as well." She gestured for him to sit beside her on the fur-covered bench where she had been keeping her vigil. For a moment, they simply shared the silence, two people facing an uncertain dawn together. Outside the narrow window, the stars were beginning to fade as the first hint of grey touched the eastern sky. "I have been thinking about your mother," Hakon said finally. "The stories say she was the finest warrior of her generation, that she could have ruled a clan in her own right if she had chosen that path. She chose love instead," Brynhild replied. "My father was not the most powerful Jarl who sought her hand, nor the wealthiest. But she said he was the one who saw her as a person rather than a prize to be won, and yet she gave up her warrior's life to become a Jarl's wife." Brynhild lifted her mother's sword, testing its familiar weight. Did she? Or did she simply find a different way to fight for what mattered to her? The question hung between them like incense in a temple, carrying implications neither of them was quite ready to voice. Her mother had indeed put aside the life of a wandering warrior woman, but she had used her position as Toste's wife to forge alliances that had kept the northern fjords peaceful for 2 decades. Perhaps that was its own form of valor, the courage to fight battles with words and wisdom rather than steel and strength. "Tell me about your father," she said, shifting the conversation to safer ground. "You have spoken of his fishing, but never of the man himself." Hakon's expression softened with memory. "He was patient. That is what I remember most clearly. The way he could sit for hours, mending nets or watching the water for signs of fish, never hurrying, never forcing the outcome he wanted. 'The sea gives what the sea chooses to give,' he would say. 'Our job is to be ready when the gift is offered.' Wise words. Did he ever speak of his youth before he took up fishing? Sometimes, when the winter nights were long and the ale had loosened his tongue." Hakon paused, as if weighing whether to share what came next. "He was not always a fisherman. Before he married my mother, before he settled down to raise a family, he traveled with the Sea Kings. He fought in the great raid on Lindisfarne, sailed with Eric Bloodaxe himself during the conquest of Orkney." Brynhild felt something cold touch her spine. "Your father was a warrior?" "One of the finest, by his own telling. But he grew tired of the killing, tired of the endless cycle of raid and revenge that marked the warrior's life. When he met my mother, he chose to lay down his sword and take up the nets instead. But he kept his skills. Oh, yes. He taught me to fight almost before he taught me to walk. A man should know how to defend what he loves," he would say. "But he should also know when fighting serves no purpose except to feed his own pride." The implications of this revelation struck Brynhild like lightning. Hakon had been trained by a veteran of legendary campaigns, a man who had learned his craft from some of the most feared warriors of their age. The fisherman's son, who would face Grim at dawn, was not the inexperienced farmer's boy that Magnus expected. "Why did you not speak of this before?" Hakon shrugged, the gesture carrying a lifetime of careful humility. "What purpose would it serve? My father chose to leave that life behind. I've tried to honor his choice by living quietly, by finding my battles in the struggle against storm and sea rather than against other men. But tomorrow you must fight. Tomorrow I must fight," he agreed. "And when I do, I will use everything my father taught me. Not just the techniques of sword and shield, but the wisdom that comes from understanding when violence serves justice and when it serves only pride." She reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work and patient dedication. "Show me what he taught you. Show me the warrior's skills hidden beneath the fisherman's patience." For the remaining hours before dawn, they worked together in her mother's chamber, Hakon demonstrating the combat techniques his father had passed down to him. They were not the flashy moves of a tournament fighter or the brutal efficiency of a berserker, but the measured, deadly skills of a professional warrior who had learned to survive against any opponent. As the grey light of morning began to filter through the window, Brynhild found herself cautiously optimistic for the first time since Magnus had arrived. Hakon would still face a formidable opponent in Grim, but he would not face him as an untrained fisherman, gambling his life on courage alone. He would meet the giant as the heir to a warrior tradition that valued skill over strength, wisdom over brutality. "It is time," she said, as the first rays of sunlight touched the eastern mountains. "The stones await." Hakon nodded, buckling on her mother's sword with movements that spoke of long familiarity with such tasks. "Whatever comes, know that I face it willingly. Some fights are worth having, regardless of their outcome." As they prepared to leave the chamber, Brynhild touched the silver arm ring one final time. Her mother's choice had been to fight for peace through alliance and negotiation. Today, her daughter would discover what form her own fight must take. The dueling stones stood on the highest hill overlooking the fjord, 7 monoliths of grey granite that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless warriors over the centuries. Each stone bore carved runes, telling the stories of champions who had fought and died on this sacred ground, their names preserved in the ancient script, even as their bones had long since returned to the earth. The morning mist clung to the circle like the breath of watching ancestors, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that reminded all present that this was no ordinary place. Magnus had arrived early with a contingent of 50 warriors, positioning them around the base of the hill in a show of force that violated no formal protocol, while making his intentions unmistakably clear. Among them stood grim Magnusson, a mountain of a man whose reputation for savagery had grown with each victory he claimed. Even at rest, he radiated menace, broad shoulders that spoke of countless hours wielding heavy weapons, arms that bore the scars of a dozen battles, and dead eyes that seemed to catalogue the bones he would soon be breaking. Toste's party approached the stones with the dignity befitting defenders of an ancient tradition. The Jarl himself led the procession, followed by his household warriors and the handful of allied neighbors who had arrived during the night to witness the combat. Behind them came the common folk of the settlement, fishermen, farmers, craftsmen, and their families, people whose lives would be forever changed by the outcome of the next hour's work. Brynhild walked beside her father, her mother's sword at her hip, her eyes fixed on the ancient stones that had overseen such contests since before the first Longhouse was built in these lands. The silver arm ring felt warm against her skin, as if responding to the presence of so much accumulated history and honor. Each previous bearer of the ring had faced moments that tested her courage and wisdom. This was her moment, and she would meet it with the strength they had bequeathed to her. Hakon moved with the calm confidence of a man who had made peace with his fate. He wore simple leather armor, reinforced with iron studs, practical protection that would not slow his movements or tire his sword arm. The sword at his side was his own choice from Toste's armory, a well-balanced blade of good steel that felt comfortable in his grip. He had declined the offer of a shield, preferring the mobility that came with fighting unencumbered. "The morning is yours." Grim Magnus' son, called the grey-bearded priest who would oversee the combat, his voice carrying the authority of one who spoke for gods and ancestors alike. "Do you accept this challenge in the sight of those who watch from beyond the veil?" Grim stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow that seemed to darken the very stones around him. When he spoke, his voice rumbled like distant thunder. "I accept, and I call upon my ancestors to witness the justice of my cause. This fish-gutter has insulted my family's honor by standing where his betters should stand. I will send him to join his father beneath the waves, and you, Hakon Olafsson." The priest continued, "Do you accept this combat in defense of House Toste and all who shelter beneath its protection?" "I accept," Hakon replied simply, his voice carrying clearly despite being pitched much lower than his opponent's bombast. "I fight not for my own glory, but for the right of good people to live free from the tyranny of those who believe strength alone grants them dominion over others." The words struck the assembled crowd like hammer blows. Here was not the usual bluster of warriors seeking fame, but the quiet statement of a man who understood exactly why he was willing to die. Even some of Magnus's own men shifted uncomfortably, perhaps remembering why they had first taken up arms in service to their clans. The priest raised his staff, its iron head glinting in the strengthening sunlight. Let the combat begin when the sun clears the eastern peaks. Let it end when one champion yields, falls, or dies. Let all who witness this contest remember that honor is not won by victory alone, but by the courage to stand for what is right even when defeat seems certain. As the final moments before combat ticked away, Brynhild found herself studying the faces of Magnus's warriors. Many were hard men who had chosen to follow a leader they respected, but a few showed signs of unease with their chieftain's methods. The fiction that this was about justice and ancient alliances was wearing thin. Even the most loyal follower could see that Magnus had orchestrated this entire situation to justify a conquest he had planned from the beginning. "Your man has courage," Magnus said quietly, moving to stand beside Toste as they watched the champions prepare for battle. "It is unfortunate that courage without skill is merely another form of suicide." "We shall see," Toste replied evenly, though Brynhild could hear the tension threading through his voice like a wire stretched to its breaking point. "Indeed we shall. And when we have seen, I trust you will remember that my offer of alliance still stands. Your daughter is lovely, and Grim will make her a strong husband once this unpleasantness is resolved." The casual assumption of victory, the dismissive way Magnus spoke of her future as if it were already decided, made Brynhild's blood sing with rage. She touched the silver arm ring, drawing strength from its solid presence, and stepped forward to address Magnus directly. "You speak of my future as if it were yours to dispose of," she said, her voice pitched to carry to every ear present. "But perhaps you presume too much. The combat has not yet begun, and champions have been known to surprise those who underestimate them." Magnus smiled, the expression as cold as winter wind. "Spoken like a true daughter of the North. Your spirit will serve you well when you learn to apply it more wisely." The condescension in his tone was perfectly calculated to provoke a response that would diminish her dignity. But Brynhild had learned patience from watching her father navigate the treacherous currents of clan politics. Instead of rising to the bait, she simply nodded as if acknowledging a compliment and moved to where Hakon was making his final preparations. "Remember what your father taught you," she said quietly, adjusting the buckle of his sword belt with practiced hands. "Read your opponent, wait for the right moment, and trust in the skills that have been passed down to you." "I remember," he replied, covering her hands with his own for just a moment. "And I remember why I fight." The sun cleared the eastern peaks, sending the first rays of direct sunlight streaming across the ancient stones. The priest raised his staff high, then brought it down with a sound like thunder. The combat had begun, and with it would come the reckoning that would determine the fate of everyone who called the northern fjords home. The first clash of steel rang across the hilltop like a bell tolling for the dead. Grim had charged forward with the confidence of a man who had never met his equal in single combat, his massive sword cutting through the air in an arc that would have cleaved a lesser opponent in two. But Hakon was not there when the blade arrived. He had flowed aside like water around a stone, using his opponent's momentum against him in a manner that spoke of training, far beyond what any fisherman should possess. The crowd's collective intake of breath was audible as Hakon's counterattack nearly found its mark, his mother's sword whisper close to opening Grim's throat before the giant managed to twist away. For the first time in years, Grim Magnusson faced an opponent who might actually challenge him, and the realization showed in his suddenly wary stance. "Interesting," Magnus murmured, though his tone suggested surprise rather than concern. "Your fisherman has some skill after all," but Brynhild barely heard him. Her attention was fixed not on the combat itself, but on something that had been nagging at her consciousness since the moment they arrived at the stones. Magnus's positioning of his warriors was wrong. Not wrong for intimidation or even for intervention should the combat go badly, but wrong for someone who truly intended to honor the outcome of single combat. His men were arranged not around the base of the hill, but along specific paths that led away from the dueling ground. It was a formation designed not to control the immediate area, but to intercept anyone trying to flee the hilltop. More tellingly, she had spotted archers among the rocks on the neighboring hills, men positioned where they could strike at the stones themselves if Magnus gave the signal. The horrible truth hit her like a physical blow. Magnus had no intention of honoring the outcome of this combat, regardless of who won. If Grim triumphed, well and good, the problem was solved cleanly. But if Hakon somehow managed the impossible and defeated the southern champion, Magnus would simply claim treachery and order his archers to kill everyone present. A tragic accident, he would tell future generations. How the noble Jarl Toste and his daughter had died when Eastern raiders attacked during the sacred combat. She glanced around desperately, trying to catch her father's eye, but Toste was focused entirely on the battle unfolding before them. Hakon was holding his own admirably, his father's training evident in every move. But even if he won this fight, it would only give Magnus the excuse he needed to abandon all pretense of honor. The silver armring seemed to burn against her skin as understanding flooded through her. This was the impossible choice her ancestors had faced, not simply between love and duty, but between the appearance of honor and the reality of survival. Her mother had chosen to fight with wisdom rather than steel, forging alliances that prevented wars rather than winning them after they started. Now, Brynhild saw her own path with crystalline clarity. The only way to save Hakon, her father, and everyone else present was to shatter the careful fiction that Magnus had constructed around this entire encounter. She had to expose his true intentions before he could act on them, and she had to do it in a way that would prevent him from simply ordering the massacre he had planned. Moving with careful casualness, she began walking around the circle of stones, as if seeking a better vantage point for watching the combat. But her real goal was the small group of Magnus's lieutenants who stood apart from their men, close enough to hear their chieftain's orders, but far enough from the crowd to speak freely among themselves. What she overheard confirmed her worst fears. Signal if the fisherman somehow wins. One was saying quietly to his companion, "The archers have their orders, and if anyone questions it later, Eastern raiders, same as always. Magnus will swear by any god they name that we arrived just too late to prevent the massacre." Brynhild felt ice form in her veins, but she forced herself to keep moving, to show no sign that she had heard anything significant. She completed her circuit of the stones and returned to stand beside her father, her mind racing as she tried to formulate a plan that might save them all. On the dueling ground, Hakon continued to acquit himself well against his massive opponent. His speed and skill were keeping him alive, but Grim's reach and strength were beginning to tell. Sweat beaded on Hakon's forehead as he was forced to give ground, his breathing becoming labored under the relentless pressure of defending against an opponent who could afford to make mistakes while he could not. "Father," she said quietly, pitching her voice so that only Toste could hear her words. "Magnus means to kill us all, regardless of the outcome." Toste's expression did not change, but she saw his hand drift almost imperceptibly toward his sword hilt. "You are certain?" "I overheard his men discussing the signal for the archers. They are positioned to strike the moment Hakon wins, if he wins, and if he loses. Then Grim kills him according to the ancient laws, and Magnus graciously offers to take me as a wife to seal our alliance. Either way, he gets what he came for." Toste's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "What do you propose?" This was the moment that would define not just her own fate, but the future of everyone she loved. Brynhild touched the silver arm ring one final time, drawing on the accumulated wisdom of all the women who had worn it before her, and made her choice. "I propose we give him something he does not expect," she said, and stepped forward into the circle of combat. "Hold!" she called, her voice cutting across the hilltop with the authority of generations of noble blood. "I claim the right of substitution. The fighting stopped instantly. Hakon stepped back, breathing hard, but still ready to continue, while Grim lowered his sword with a puzzled frown. Around the circle, warriors and common folk alike stared at the Jarl's daughter, who had just invoked one of the oldest and most sacred laws of their people. "Substitution is not permitted once combat has begun," Magnus said sharply, his carefully laid plans suddenly threatened by this unexpected development. "Substitution is permitted," the grey-bearded priest corrected firmly, "when the original challenge was made under false pretenses, or when new information comes to light that changes the nature of the dispute." Brynhild walked to the center of the circle, her mother's sword gleaming at her side, and addressed not Magnus, but the assembled crowd. "I claim that this challenge was made under false pretenses. Magnus' son did not come here seeking justice or honoring ancient alliances. He came seeking conquest, and he has positioned archers in the surrounding hills to ensure that conquest, regardless of how this combat ends." A murmur ran through the crowd like wind through standing grain. Magnus's face darkened with rage, but he could not deny the accusation without inviting an immediate search of the hills that would prove her words true. "Furthermore," Brynhild continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "I claim that the true dispute here is not between champions representing their clans, but between two ways of understanding what it means to live with honor. Grim Magnus' son fights for the right of the strong to take what they desire. I will fight for the right of all people to choose their own path in life. You?" Grim laughed, a sound like boulders grinding together. "You would face me in single combat?" "I would," she replied simply, "unless you fear that your reputation cannot survive victory over a woman." The insult was perfectly delivered, impossible to ignore without admitting cowardice before every warrior present. Grim's face flushed red with anger, and he hefted his massive sword as if imagining how it would feel to cleave her in two. "So be it," he snarled. "I will send you to join your fisherman lover in death." But Magnus was too clever to be trapped so easily. "The substitution is refused," he declared. "My son has accepted combat with Hakon Olafsson, and that combat he will finish. The substitution is not yours to refuse," the priest said firmly. "The ancient laws are clear. When a member of the challenged house claims right of substitution for legitimate cause, that right cannot be denied." Magnus found himself caught between his carefully laid plans and the traditions that gave his conquest any pretense of legitimacy. To reject the priest's ruling would be to admit that he cared nothing for the laws he claimed to uphold, which would justify resistance by every clan in the region. Brynhild drew her mother's sword, its steel singing as it cleared the scabbard. "I stand ready to prove the justice of my cause," she announced. "Does Grim Magnusson dare face the daughter of the house he would destroy?" The silence that followed Brynhild's challenge stretched like a taut rope over an abyss. Every person present understood that they had just witnessed something unprecedented. A Jarl's daughter claiming the right to face a legendary champion in single combat, staking not just her own life, but the honor of her entire house on the outcome of personal battle. The ancient stones seemed to lean inward, as if the spirits of past warriors were gathering to witness this moment that would be spoken of for generations. Grim Magnus' son stood frozen in the center of the circle, his massive sword half raised, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, rage, and calculation. To refuse combat with a woman would mark him as a coward in the eyes of every warrior present. To accept meant risking his reputation on a fight that should have been beneath his notice, yet one that could prove far more dangerous than anyone anticipated. "This is madness," Magnus declared, though his voice lacked its usual commanding certainty. "Brynhild Toste, daughter, your courage does you honor, but this is not a matter for women," she interrupted, her words cutting across his like a blade through silk. "Tell that to Queen Thorgerd, who held the walls of Bergen against 1,000 Danish warriors. Tell it to Sigrid the Stern, who burned her unwanted suitors alive in their own feast hall. Tell it to my mother." who earned her reputation as the finest sword fighter of her generation before choosing to lay down her blade for love. Each name she spoke carried weight that resonated through the assembled crowd. These were not ancient legends, but women whose deeds were remembered by living witnesses, whose choices had shaped the world these people inhabited. By invoking them, Brynhild claimed her place in a tradition that even the most traditional warriors could not deny. Hakon moved to her side, his chest still heaving from his exertions against Grim, his face a mixture of admiration and desperate concern. "Oh, Brynhild, you cannot—" "I can," she said quietly, her eyes never leaving Grim's face. "And I must. This was always meant to be my fight, not yours. I see that now." The truth of her words struck him like a physical blow. From the beginning, this had been about her marriage, her future, her right to choose her own path through life. Hakon's challenge had been born of love and loyalty, but it had also been an attempt to fight her battle for her, to spare her the necessity of standing up for herself when the cost might be her life. "Stand aside." "Fisherman," Grim rumbled, his voice thick with contempt, "if this foolish girl wishes to die for her pride, I will grant her that mercy quickly." "Your mercy," Brynhild replied, beginning to pace around the circle's edge with the fluid grace of a hunting cat, "is neither requested nor required. What I require is for you to prove that your reputation rests on more than the intimidation of smaller men and the favor of your father's name." The insult was carefully calculated, designed to goad Grim into reckless anger, while simultaneously positioning the fight in terms that would resonate with every warrior present. This was not about a woman's foolish attempt to match herself against a superior opponent. This was about whether true skill could triumph over brute force and inherited advantage. Magnus stepped forward, his face dark with fury at seeing his carefully orchestrated conquest spiraling beyond his control. "Enough, Grim, end this nonsense. Kill the girl and be done with it." The crude command was exactly the wrong thing to say in front of an audience steeped in traditions of honor and proper conduct. Several of Magnus's own warriors shifted uncomfortably, their hands moving to weapon hilts, not in preparation for battle, but in unconscious rejection of their chieftain's words. To order a champion to simply kill the girl reduced sacred combat to mere butchery, stripping away the veneer of righteousness that made conquest palatable. The grey-bearded priest raised his staff, his voice carrying the authority of gods and ancestors. "The challenge has been properly made and properly accepted. Let no man interfere with what the old laws have set in motion." Toste stood silent through this exchange, his face a mask of controlled emotion that revealed nothing of the turmoil within. Brynhild knew her father well enough to read the signs, the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his breathing had become carefully measured, the almost imperceptible shift of his weight that suggested readiness for violence. He was preparing for the possibility that Magnus would abandon all pretense and order his men to attack, regardless of the combat's outcome. "If you must do this," Hakon said quietly, moving close enough to speak without being overheard, "remember that size and strength mean nothing if you can avoid his attacks entirely. Your mother's sword is lighter than his weapon. Use that advantage." "I remember her lessons," Brynhild assured him, though her voice carried a tremor that spoke of the fear she was fighting to control. Speed over strength, patience over fury, precision over power. She thought of her mother's training sessions in the early morning hours, when the Longhouse slept and they could practice without drawing unwanted attention to skills that some might consider inappropriate for a Jarl's daughter. Her mother had been a demanding teacher, accepting no excuses and tolerating no shortcuts, insisting that if Brynhild meant to learn the warrior's art, she would learn it properly or not at all. "Your stance betrays your training," her mother had said during one particularly intense session. "Anyone who knows what to look for can see that you have been taught by someone who understood battle, not just the pretty forms they teach noble children. Use that knowledge when you must, but understand that using it will reveal more about our family than some might find comfortable. Now, as she faced the prospect of putting those hard-learned skills to their ultimate test. Brynhild understood what her mother had been preparing her for, not the specific challenge of this moment, which no one could have foreseen, but the broader reality that a woman in their world might someday need to fight for the right to control her own destiny. The silver arm ring seemed to pulse with warmth against her skin, as if responding to the intensity of the moment. Each woman who had worn it before her had faced impossible choices, her mother had said. But perhaps the choice was not between competing obligations. Perhaps it was between accepting the roles others assigned and claiming the right to define those roles for yourself. Grim had finished his own preparations, checking the balance of his sword and the security of his armor with the methodical attention of a professional warrior. Despite his crude manner and his father's lack of honor, he was not a man to underestimate. His victories had been earned through skill as well as strength, and he would not make the mistake of assuming that Brynhild's courage made her dangerous. "Are you ready to die for your pride, girl?" he asked, his voice carrying clearly across the circle. "Are you ready to discover that your reputation was built on the fear of men too wise to test themselves against you?" She replied, drawing her mother's sword in a single fluid motion that spoke of countless hours of practice. The blade caught the morning sunlight like captured fire, its steel bright and eager after years of peaceful rest. This sword had tasted blood in defense of just causes, had been wielded by a woman who understood that sometimes the only way to preserve what you loved was to risk everything in its defense. The priest raised his staff once more, his voice carrying the weight of ancient tradition. "Let the combat begin when I speak the word. Let it end when one yields, falls, or dies. Let all who witness remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act rightly despite that fear." Brynhild settled into her fighting stance, feeling the familiar weight of the sword in her hands, the careful balance that allowed for both attack and defense. Round the circle the crowd held its collective breath, understanding that they were about to witness something that would be remembered long after all of them had returned to the earth. In the surrounding hills, Magnus's hidden archers waited for the signal that would turn sacred combat into massacre. But first, they would watch as the daughter of House Toste either claimed her place among the legendary women warriors of their people or died in the attempt. Either way, the old world was ending, and whatever came next would be shaped by the choices made in the next few moments. "Begin," the priest commanded, and the fate of the northern fjords hung on the edge of a young woman's sword. Grim's first attack came like an avalanche, overwhelming force delivered with devastating precision. His massive sword swept through the air in an arc that would have cleaved Brynhild from shoulder to hip had she been where he expected her to be. But her mother's training had taught her that surviving against a larger opponent meant never being where that opponent anticipated. And she flowed away from the strike like morning mist before the wind. Her counterattack came immediately, the lighter blade seeking the gap between Grim's armor plates with surgical precision. The point found its mark, drawing first blood as it scraped along his ribs before he could twist away. The wound was shallow, more insult than injury, but it served its purpose, establishing that this would not be the quick execution Grim had expected. A murmur ran through the crowd as they realized what they were witnessing. This was not a helpless girl flailing desperately against inevitable doom, but a trained warrior implementing a carefully considered strategy. Every movement Brynhild made spoke of disciplined instruction and countless hours of practice, her footwork displaying the kind of economy that only came from true mastery of the fighting arts. "Impossible," Magnus breathed, his confident expression cracking for the first time since his arrival. Where did she learn to fight like that? But Toste said nothing, his eyes fixed on his daughter with a mixture of pride and terror that spoke volumes about secrets long kept within the family. He had known of his wife's training sessions with Brynhild, had even encouraged them, understanding that the world they lived in offered no guarantees of safety for anyone, regardless of station or gender. Grim recovered quickly from his surprise, adjusting his tactics to account for an opponent who possessed actual skill rather than mere desperation. His second attack was more measured, a series of probing strikes designed to test Brynhild's defenses and identify weaknesses he could exploit. But each thrust and cut met only empty air or the precise parry of her mother's sword, the lighter weapon moving with liquid grace to deflect his heavier blade. The pattern of combat began to establish itself, Grim pressing forward with the relentless pressure of superior reach and strength, Brynhild giving ground while looking for openings to exploit. It was a dangerous game, one that favored the larger warrior over time, but she had expected this from the beginning. Victory would come through patience and precision, not through matching her opponent's brute force. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory as she fought. A smaller warrior cannot afford to trade blow for blow with a larger opponent. You must make them pay for every attack while avoiding their attempts to retaliate. Patience, precision, and the willingness to take calculated risks, these are your weapons against superior size. The third exchange brought them to the center of the circle, directly between two of the ancient standing stones. Grim's overhead strike carried enough force to split a tree trunk, but Brynhild was no longer there when it arrived. She had stepped inside his reach, her blade seeking the vulnerable spot beneath his raised arm. Only his experience and quick reflexes saved him from a mortal wound, though her steel still found flesh, opening a line of red across his bicep. "Stand still and die cleanly, girl." Grim snarled, his composure beginning to crack under the accumulated frustration of fighting an opponent who refused to behave according to his expectations. Death should be earned, not granted as a courtesy, Brynhild replied, her breathing controlled, despite the intensity of their exchange. "If you want my life, prove you deserve to take it." The words carried beyond their immediate meaning, resonating with every person present who had ever faced the choice between submission and resistance. This was about more than combat between two individuals. It was about the fundamental question of whether strength alone granted the right to dominion over others. Hakon watched from the circle's edge, his hands clenched into fists as he forced himself to remain still, while the woman he loved risked everything for the principle they both held dear. Every instinct screamed at him to intervene, to step between Brynhild and the death that seemed to wait for her with each of Grim's attacks. But he understood that interfering now would invalidate everything she was fighting to prove. Around the hilltop, warriors from both sides found themselves drawn into the drama unfolding before them. Even some of Magnus's men were beginning to look uncomfortable with their chieftain's methods, seeing in Brynhild's courage a reminder of why they had first taken up arms in service to their people. The clear-cut narrative of conquest and submission was becoming muddied by the reality of watching someone fight not for power or wealth, but for the simple right to choose her own path through life. Magnus himself stood rigid with barely controlled fury, his carefully laid plans crumbling as the combat he had expected to be a brief formality stretched into genuine contest. Worse, he could see the effect Brynhild's performance was having on the assembled crowd, the way they were beginning to view her not as a rebellious daughter defying proper authority, but as a symbol of resistance against tyranny. The fourth exchange brought fresh blood, though this time it flowed from a shallow cut across Brynhild's forearm, where Grim's blade had slipped past her guard. The wound was minor, but it served as a reminder that her strategy, while effective so far, carried enormous risk. One mistake, one moment of fatigue or lost concentration, and Grim's superior strength would end the fight decisively. But as she felt the warm blood trickling down her arm, Brynhild also felt something else, a fierce joy that had nothing to do with the prospect of victory or defeat. For the first time in her life, she was fighting for something that truly mattered to her, using skills that were entirely her own, making choices that would determine her fate rather than accepting the decisions others made for her. The silver arm ring caught the light as she moved, its ancient surface seeming to glow with approval from all the strong women who had worn it before her. The tide of battle began to turn as Grim's initial confidence gave way to growing desperation. Each failed attack cost him energy, while Brynhild's defensive strategy allowed her to conserve her strength, waiting for the moment when his size would become a liability rather than an advantage. Her mother's teachings had prepared her for exactly this scenario, the patient warrior who could outlast a stronger opponent's initial fury. But Grim was no fool, and his reputation had not been built on brute force alone. Recognizing that his current approach was failing, he began to change tactics, using his superior reach to keep Brynhild at a distance while wearing down her defenses with a series of measured attacks. The strategy was sound, and she found herself being pushed steadily backward toward the edge of the combat circle. "Growing tired, girl," Grim taunted, though his own breathing had become labored from the sustained effort of trying to pin down such an elusive opponent. "Your pretty dancing will not save you when there is nowhere left to run." Brynhild said nothing, conserving her breath while her mind raced through the possibilities available to her. The edge of the circle was approaching, and with it the moment when she would be forced to make her stand. Everything she had learned, everything her mother had taught her, everything she believed about the right to determine her own fate, all of it would be decided in the next few moments. The silver arm ring seemed to pulse with warmth against her skin, and suddenly she could almost hear her mother's voice, speaking words that had never been said but somehow felt more real than memory. "When the moment comes, trust in yourself. Trust in the strength that has been passed down to you. Trust in the skills that are your birthright. And trust in the cause that gives your struggle meaning." Grim sensed her apparent retreat and pressed forward more aggressively, his massive sword cutting through the air in a series of attacks designed to overwhelm her defenses through sheer persistence. But his eagerness made him careless, and Brynhild saw the opening she had been waiting for, a moment when his momentum carried him slightly off balance. When his guard dropped just enough to create the opportunity she needed, she stopped retreating. Instead of continuing backward, she stepped forward and inside his reach, her mother's sword moving with liquid precision to find the gap between his helmet and gorget. The blade slid home with surgical accuracy, and for a heartbeat that seemed to last forever, the hilltop fell completely silent. Grim's eyes widened in shock and disbelief. He tried to speak, but only blood emerged from his lips. His massive sword fell from nerveless fingers to clatter against the ancient stones, and then he followed it down, collapsing like a felled tree. The legendary champion, who had never known defeat, lay still beneath the morning sun. His reputation and his life ended by the skill and courage of a young woman fighting for the right to choose her own destiny. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, broken finally by a single voice from among Magnus's warriors. "She won," the man said, his tone carrying a mixture of awe and disbelief. The girl actually won. The implications of that simple statement rippled through the assembled crowd like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Brynhild had not merely survived the combat, she had triumphed completely, proving beyond any possible doubt that her cause had been just and her courage genuine. According to the ancient laws that even Magnus claimed to honor, the matter was settled, but Magnus himself stood frozen in rage and calculation, his face cycling through expressions that revealed the fury of a man whose carefully laid plans had been shattered by an outcome he had never considered possible. His son lay dead. His narrative of righteous conquest had been exposed as naked aggression, and his own warriors were looking at him with expressions that suggested their loyalty was no longer the certainty it had once been. "Treachery," he said finally, his voice carrying across the hilltop with desperate authority. "No mere girl could defeat Grim in fair combat. She has used sorcery or poison on her blade, or some other dishonorable trick." The accusation was absurd on its face. The combat had been witnessed by hundreds of people, conducted under the supervision of a priest whose integrity was beyond question, and fought with weapons inspected by representatives of both houses. But Magnus was grasping for any justification that would allow him to reject the outcome, and proceed with his original plan. The combat was fairly fought and fairly won, the grey-bearded priest declared, his voice carrying the authority of gods and ancestors. Let no man question what all have witnessed, but Magnus was beyond the reach of reason or tradition now. His hand moved to his sword hilt, and Brynhild saw in his eyes the cold calculation of a man who had decided that if he could not have what he wanted through subterfuge, he would take it through open violence. "Kill them all," he commanded his warriors, his voice harsh with rage and desperation. "Kill them all, and let the world believe that Eastern raiders were responsible." The moment of ultimate truth had arrived. Would Magnus's men follow orders that stripped away all pretense of honor? Or would they choose to stand with the woman who had just proven that courage and skill could triumph over brute force, an inherited privilege? On the hilltops around them, the hidden archers drew their bowstrings, waiting for the signal that would turn sacred ground into a killing field, for a heartbeat that felt like eternity. The fate of everyone present hung on the edge of decision. Magnus's order to kill echoed across the hilltop, but his warriors hesitated, their hands hovering over weapon hilts as they grappled with a command that would transform them from soldiers into murderers. These were men who had followed Magnus because they believed in strength and victory, not because they wished to slaughter defenseless people on sacred ground. Then one of Magnus's own lieutenants, a grizzled veteran named Thorvald, who had served the clan for 20 years, stepped forward and threw his sword at Magnus's feet. "I will not dishonor my ancestors by killing women and priests in a sacred circle," he declared, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned assembly. "Find yourself another butcher, Magnus. I'm done with your service." The gesture rippled through the ranks like wildfire. One by one, other warriors began laying down their weapons, choosing honor over obedience, principle over profit. Not all of Magnus's men joined the rebellion. Perhaps a third remained loyal to their chieftain, but enough stepped aside to make the massacre he had planned impossible to execute. In the hills around them, the hidden archers found themselves facing a new reality. Their targets were no longer helpless victims waiting for slaughter, but a mixture of armed warriors, some hostile and some allied, spread across terrain that made accurate shooting nearly impossible. The careful plan that had seemed so foolproof an hour earlier had dissolved into chaos. Magnus stood isolated in the center of the circle, his face purple with rage as he realized that his authority had crumbled along with his strategy. "Cowards!" he screamed at the men who had abandoned him. Fools who value empty gestures over victory. Victory? Brynhild stepped forward, her mother's sword still in her hand, its blade stained with Grimm's blood. What victory could there be in murdering people who trusted your word? What honor could there be in breaking faith with the laws that bind our people together? She looked around the circle, meeting the eyes of warriors from both sides, speaking not just to Magnus, but to everyone present. "This is what we fought about today. Not whether I would marry Grimm, not whether the northern clans would submit to the southern ones, but whether we would live by principles that make us better than beasts, or whether we would abandon those principles the moment they became inconvenient." Her words carried the moral authority that came from having risked everything for her beliefs and emerged victorious. Even Magnus's remaining loyal warriors seemed uncomfortable under her gaze, understanding that they had chosen to stand with a man who valued expediency over honor. Toste stepped forward to join his daughter, his own sword drawn but held in a gesture of readiness rather than aggression. "Magnus Ironwill, you came to my lands under guest right, swore by the ancient laws, and participated in sacred combat. Now you order murder on holy ground. You have broken every oath that makes civilized life possible. Then what would you have me do?" Magnus snarled, though his defiance was beginning to crack under the weight of isolation and failed plans. "Retreat with my tail between my legs? Accept defeat from a fisherman's brat and a girl barely old enough to be married? I would have you remember what it means to be a leader rather than a tyrant," Hakon said quietly, moving to stand beside Brynhild with the calm dignity that had first drawn her to him. A true leader serves his people's welfare, not his own ambition. The simple words struck home with devastating effect. Around the circle, men who had followed Magnus for years began to see their chieftain through new eyes, not as a strong leader who demanded respect, but as a man whose hunger for power had led him to abandon every principle that made leadership worthy of respect. Magnus looked around the circle, seeing his isolation, understanding that his gamble had failed completely. But rather than accepting defeat with grace, he chose the path of desperate violence. His sword cleared its sheath with desperate speed, aimed not at the warriors who had defied him, but at Brynhild herself, one final act of spite designed to destroy what he could not possess. But Hakon was already moving, his fisherman's reflexes honed by years of reading wind and wave, translating seamlessly to reading the intentions of a desperate enemy. His shoulder took Magnus in the chest, driving the older man backward and sending his strike wide. They went down together in a tangle of limbs and steel, rolling across the ancient stones as each fought for advantage. The struggle was brief but fierce. Magnus had experience and cunning, but Hakon had youth and the desperate strength that came from protecting what he loved most. When they finally separated, Magnus lay still, Hakon's knife buried in his chest, his eyes staring sightlessly at the sky that had witnessed his final gamble. The silence that followed was different from the tension that had marked the day's earlier events. This was the quiet of resolution, of conflicts settled and choices made. The remaining members of Magnus's warband looked at each other uncertainly, leaderless and far from home, facing the prospect of explaining to their families how their expedition had ended in disaster. Thorvald, the veteran who had first refused Magnus's final order, stepped forward to address the survivors. "We came here following a man we thought worthy of our service. We have learned otherwise. Any who wish to return to the southern fjords may do so with our protection. Any who wish to seek service elsewhere will have safe passage through our lands." The offer was more generous than anyone had expected, but it reflected the reality that punishing soldiers for their leaders' crimes would only perpetuate the cycle of revenge that had brought them to this point. Better to end the matter here, with honor on all sides, than to create new grievances that would fester for generations. As the sun reached its zenith, the various groups began to disperse. Magnus's men gathered their chieftain's body and departed for the long journey home, while Toste's people returned to their daily lives with the knowledge that their world had changed forever. The old balance of power in the northern fjords was gone. But what would replace it remained to be seen. Brynhild stood with Hakon at the edge of the dueling stones, looking out over the fjord that had been her home since childhood. The silver arm ring caught the sunlight, its ancient metal warm against her skin. She thought of her mother, of all the women who had worn the ring before her, of the impossible choices they had faced and the courage they had shown. "What comes next?" Hakon asked quietly. She smiled, feeling for the first time in months that the future was truly hers to choose. "Next, we build something better than what came before, something worth the price we paid to defend it." The wind from the sea carried the promise of new possibilities, and Brynhild welcomed them all.